Hello and welcome everyone to the public meeting of the VC Lodge of the Theosophical Society. Today our speaker is David Bruce, and I'm going to introduce him in a moment. All I'm asking you today first is to mute yourself, and then I'm going to read our invocation that we read every meeting at the beginning. And then I'm going to introduce David, and then I'm going to hand it over to David. So welcome everybody, especially those who don't know, that are not familiar with our lodge. And let me just okay. So please feel free to read loud at home with me. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. Okay, everyone. So today, David Bruce is going to speak. He's a third-generation theosophist. He was active in the Milwaukee Lodge for 18 years before moving to the TSA national headquarters in 2003 to serve as Director of Education. In 2010, he was promoted to the position of National Secretary, a job that entails working with local lodges and study centers. David also manages the prison program as well as the National Lodge of the TSA. He has given lectures and workshops to many theosophical groups across the United States. So please welcome. And David, thank you so much for volunteering. I'm just trying, and you are here now on unmuted and ready to go.
Thank you, Suzanne. Very happy to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm grateful for the opportunity provided by the DC Lodge to speak to you about a topic that is dear to my heart, having to do with one of my favorite theosophical books, The Secret Doctrine, as I'm sure it is of many of you. We are just going to touch upon one aspect of this today because, as you know, The Secret Doctrine in its 2 volumes is over 1,500 pages, and almost any page in those 1,500 is possible to expound on at great length. It's got such depth, such density, but I'm going to talk about the writing of The Secret Doctrine. And as you can tell from the title, there is some question as to who wrote The Secret Doctrine. Now, those of you that have been around for a while, I think you probably know where I'm going with this, but if you're fairly new or have not read The Secret Doctrine or much of the history, that might be fairly new information for you. But in any case, I had first given this talk in Hartford, Connecticut in 2012, and then a few years later in Cleveland. But I've added some new material, and I'm kind of excited to give it again. So let's go to the next slide, if we could. I like to frame a lot of my talks by giving some kind of context. And in this case, I'd like to give kind of a historical perspective first. And then after that, I talk a little bit about Blavatsky and her teachers. Then I have a number of testimonials or quotes or excerpts from the literature relating to the actual process of when HBB was writing her manuscript. And then finally, a few short words about the importance, what I feel the importance is of The Secret Doctrine today. I'll be quoting again from The Secret Doctrine there, and then a final summing up. And that's where we're going today. Hopefully we'll get through all that in about 50 minutes or less, but we'll see how it goes. So next slide, please. I'm going to start with a quote by John Locke. He's an English philosopher, as many of you might know. He was one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment period, the period that historians call the Enlightenment. His ideas were very powerful, and they influenced the writing of our Declaration of Independence, and also the founding fathers of our country were very much taken with his writings as they were with others. So here's the historical background that I want to lead in. Let me just read the quote. I'm sure you've read it, but new opinions are always suspected and usually opposed without any other reason but because they are not already common. In other words, we're not familiar with something when it's new. By definition, we're not familiar. So our knee-jerk tendency is to become defensive or reject it out of hand. And in the life of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, she encountered intense, I'm underlining that word, intense opposition to her ideas. Actually, they weren't her ideas, technically speaking, but the ideas that she put forth from the wisdom tradition. But that has also happened throughout history. It happens today. It probably always will be, because human beings are human beings, and we are what we are. But if we go back a couple thousand years, 2,500 years ago, you've heard about ancient Greece, where they had the mystery schools, and before that in ancient Egypt. But at some point, the mystery schools of Greece became kind of corrupted, you might say, and they eventually died out. But that's where the true esoteric teachings were taught to the few. Well, a few centuries later, the rise of Christianity occurred, and many of the esoteric teachings around the Mediterranean area were swept off the table, so to speak. In other words, they had to go underground. And as Christianity became institutionalized and it gained power, it became a dominant force in the West, mainly Western Europe. And then later, the Roman Empire, which had influence over vast territories, it collapsed, as you know. And then we have what historians have called the Dark Ages. During this time, it was unfortunate, but rational thinking kind of took a backseat to, we can say, religious dogma. And so that went on for a while, that being the Dark Ages. In the period from the 14th to the 17th century, that's 1300 to approximately 1700, that is known as the Renaissance. You've all heard of that, I'm sure. And one of the things that distinguishes the Renaissance as a historical period is that during that time, Greek philosophy, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Plotinus, Plato, Greek philosophy was rediscovered. And during this period of time, there were some people who came forth with ideas that resulted in them being persecuted, and even at the loss of their life. I'll just give you 3 examples, which I'm sure you've heard most of these names, but we could have many, many more if this were a 2-hour lecture. But you've heard of Copernicus, the astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. He was born in the 15th century. And his contribution to scientific thought was the idea that the Earth and all the planets revolves around the sun, because before that, the model that held sway was by the Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy, where Ptolemy said everything revolves around the planet Earth. And Copernicus said no, and he called his system the heliocentric, helio meaning sun, the heliocentric system. And of course, the church did not like that. They didn't catch on to his publication right away. And he was a very smart fellow, you might say, because he had the good sense to die in 1543 before the Inquisition got a hold of his writings. And had he not done that, chances are very good that he would have died in the hands of the Inquisition under great pain and cruelty. Another luminary of the period is Giordano Bruno. He was a philosopher and a mathematician, a metaphysician, and he was born in Italy, but he lived his whole life on the run, so to speak, kind of like the Fugitive series where David Jansen played the fugitive. Well, Giordano Bruno was always on the move because he was being persecuted. Eventually, to make a long story short, he was burned at the stake by the Christian church, the supposed purveyors of brotherly love. And then we have Galileo, the Italian scientist. He championed the ideas of Copernicus, which displeased the church. And he too suffered the wrath of the Inquisition. He was under intense pressure and persecution. And finally, out of sheer weariness, he relented and he recanted his views. We might say he recanted under duress. And then they kind of let up, but not really, because they kept Galileo under house arrest for the rest of his life. So again, this all goes back to the statement here by John Locke. And Blavatsky did not lose her life, but she suffered terrible, terrible things that were said about her, slander, and so forth. So then in the 18th century, a new movement swept Europe, and this was called the Enlightenment. This was a period where reason and rational thought came to the forefront, largely in conjunction with scientists who were discovering all sorts of things. On the social and political front, new ideas such as liberty, fraternity, and progress in places like France, these ideas gained wider acceptance. So the church at this time was still very powerful, but its power was starting to diminish. And as dogmatic beliefs gave way to empirical fact, or as narrow-minded thinking gave way to intellectual curiosity. So by the time of the mid to late 19th century, this is a time when Blavatsky and the founders were alive, religion had been, at least in the intelligentsia, the elite, religion had been eclipsed by science as the go-to source for finding out answers to important questions. But the science of that time was a very materialistic science. It wasn't the science of today. It was very materialistic. And along with that was swept away any ideas of God, miracles, the supernatural. I'm talking about the elites, well-educated people, the well-to-do. I'm not talking about the common folk, because they were still very religious. But the people, the movers and shakers, they subscribed to this very materialistic scientific view. So it was into this world that H.P. Blavatsky released her publication, The Secret Doctrine. And that was a book which would draw fire from her enemies, both within the scientific community as well as the religious institutions. Now, mind you, the religious people and the scientific people did not see eye to eye. They were at loggerheads, but they did agree on one thing. They didn't like the ideas put forth in the Secret Doctrine and all the other writings of Blavatsky. In that, they were united. Now, periodically, what we call the Brotherhood of Adepts, Blavatsky's teachers, by the way, they were part of that brotherhood. They go by different names, the Mahatmas, the Masters of Wisdom. But periodically, they're working behind the scenes, so to speak, but they send emissaries or messengers into the outer world to convey their teachings when they feel the time is right. And HPB fulfilled that role. She was their messenger or their agent, and they say so in their words. She first met her teacher in the flesh in London at Hyde Park in 1851. She was 20 years old. At that time, it was made clear to her that what kind of a role the Mahatmas had in mind for her. She was warned that it would not be easy. There would be many difficulties. But fortunately for you and I, you and me, she did accept that, and we have this wonderful legacy. Then 18 years later, in 1869, she's almost 40 now, she traveled to Tibet or Nepal, we're not quite sure exactly where, but she actually stayed there for a time to study in person with her teachers. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, Suzanne, next slide, please. Okay, why did they choose her? Well, did we skip can we go back? I think we might have skipped a slide there. Yes, this is a excerpt from one of the letters. I believe this is from Master K.H. And he says, after nearly a century of fruitless search, our chiefs had to avail themselves of the only opportunity to send out a European body upon European soil to serve as a connecting link between that country and our own. They're in India or Nepal, I mean in India or Tibet, and there's a lot in this to unpack, but we're just, obviously they've been looking for the right person to serve as an agent for them. Now we can go to the next slide. The question is, why did they pick her after all that searching? Well, 3 reasons. As you know, she had a strong psychical nature. She did a phenomenal thing. She was able to do phenomenal things. A lot of that training came from the time that she was in Tibet, but she also was born. She was gifted that way. She had a very powerful intellect, and she was able to grasp subtle and abstruse metaphysical concepts, and then finally strength of character. That's very important. She had unshakable courage, fierce loyalty, and unwavering devotion, both to the mission and to the masters. We can go to the next slide now. So the question is, in general, this is in general, not just in regard to the Secret Doctrine, but there are many times in literature, you look at a book and it says the title and the author, like for example, East of Eden by John Steinbeck, or whatever, you know, Call of the Wild by Jack London. And it's obviously that Jack London wrote Call of the Wild and John Steinbeck wrote East of Eden and many others. But there are times, and this is what's very interesting, I think, is that the author is not necessarily the writer or vice versa. And sometimes we don't even know who the author or writer was. So these situations fall into several categories. We can go to the next slide now. And in the next slide, I've outlined 4 categories. When do these questions arise? Well, when something is written anonymously, or when a pseudonym, that's like a stage name, a false name that is used. Ghostwriters sometimes are hired for producing a book. And this next one, Amanuenses, that's plural, it's a Latin word, Amanuenses is singular. I'll explain what that is in due course. So let's go ahead and let's look at the first category in the next slide. Some examples of anonymously written books. And I'm sure you can think of some other ones. The Upanishads from the Vedas, we don't know who wrote those marvelous, austere, inspirational, highly spiritual writings. Another book that many of you are familiar with, I'll just hold it up right here. The Cloud of Unknowing. It was written in the 14th century. It's a book of Christian mysticism, and it was originally written in Middle English. You and I probably cannot understand that. John Eljo could, people like that, but we don't know who wrote it. It was probably a monk, or could even be a nun. Some people have speculated. Common Sense. That was a pamphlet by Thomas Paine during the time of the American Revolution. I have a book here of essays and eclectic writings of Thomas Paine. But why did he write that anonymously? Well, for political reasons. We were trying to separate from the British Empire, and he would have been arrested under sedition, charges of sedition, had they known his identity. You may not have known, but HPB and others had submitted certain articles to the Theosophical Journal Lucifer during the 1890s. It was published for a few years. Any other examples may come to mind?
The Bible.
Yes? Okay.
The Bible.
Oh, yes, yes. All righty. So let's go ahead to stay on course here. The next category is pseudonyms. And again, we have many, many cases. The Federalist Papers, originally it was called the Federalist, but these were written originally by the Latin name Publius, which was a Roman general responsible for the founding of Rome. But the papers were published by Alexander Hamilton. And here's it's quite a large book of writings. And this was published around 1787 to 1788. It was by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. You have George Eliot. Well, that was the pen name for a woman writer during the Victorian period, because at that time it was not considered proper in Britain for a woman to make a living being a writer. So Mary Ann Evans adopted the man's name, George Eliot. Charles Dodgson wrote, well, you probably don't, unless you know, he went by the name of Lewis Carroll, who was the author of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Some of you older folks like me might remember the Nancy Drew novels, and that's what Carol Keene, well, that's actually not the name, that's a pseudonym. And it's a collective pseudonym because the Nancy Drew novels were written over a 70-year period of time, starting in the 1930s up to 2000. And they had many different writers write those novels under the name Carolyn Keene. And you may not have known this, but John Algiel, former president of the Theosophical Society, and I have this on good authority, my wife, because she worked with John for many years in the main office. She was his administrative secretary. John was such a prolific writer. He did write many articles both for the Adyar Theosophist and the American Theosophist under his own name. But he was so prolific that he submitted some articles under make-believe names or pseudonyms. I always wanted to make that a project for myself sometime to go through that, those 9 years of his presidency, and try to figure out which articles were submitted by John. I'll give you one more example that I don't have here up on the chart, At the Feet of the Master. We know it was written by the young boy Jiddu Krishnamurti, but it's published in the Theosophical Press under Alcyone. Alcyone is actually the name of a star in the constellation Taurus. There's many examples of pseudonyms for various different reasons being used. So let's go to the next category, which is ghostwriters. I won't spend much time here. Famous people, celebrities, politicians, musicians, pop stars, people who have very extraordinary talents, writing which may not be one of their talents. That's why they hire ghostwriters. So they might write a book that says JFK or George Bush or whoever, or Elton John, but it's not actually written by them. It's written by ghostwriters, and ghostwriters don't even get their names put on the book. So then we have the last category, kind of interesting. The author is not the writer, and that's when the author, for some reason, hires an amanuensis, which is a Latin word, as I said. That is an artistic assistant, someone who takes dictation and writes down manuscripts. Believe it or not, in the book of Romans, the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 22, Tertius says, I am the one who wrote these down for the Apostle Paul. He functioned as an amanuensis. You can look it up. The great English writer, John Milton, his epic work, this masterpiece of the English language. I'm going to just hold this up. This is a huge book, and this is my treasured Folio Society copy. And it's got wonderful illustrations by William Blake. This has over 10,000 lines of poetry. And guess what? Why did he hire an amanuensis? Because he was blind. He was blind when he wrote the whole thing. He had lost his sight 4 or 5 years earlier. So he had various people. He dictated it. And just imagine that, the feat of putting these things together in your mind. Most writers, they use an outline. They have some kind of an outline before they actually start writing. Milton had to do these 10,000 lines of poetry all in his head, and he dictated it to these various scribes. Then we even have a composer, not a major composer, but an English composer, Frederick Delius. Some of his works are on YouTube. The classical station in Chicago sometimes plays them. He lost his sight in later years, and he had an amanuensis by the name of Eric Fenby transcribe his compositions. And then we might even mention the mysterious case of Light on the Path. You've heard of that one, right? Light on the Path. If you open the title page, it says, it doesn't say by, it says written down by MC, two initials, MC, written down, not by. So that's a whole different story, but MC, as we know, is Mabel Collins. So we've looked at these four categories. None of these categories really apply to H.P. Blavatsky in her writing The Secret Doctrine. She didn't use pseudonyms, and she didn't employ the services of an amanuensis, unless you want to consider when she had the papers all written down and there were thousands of sheets of paper scattered around, and she had the Kiteleys and other friends try to organize them into some kind of order. That's the same thing that Plotinus did when he wrote his Enneads and other books. He had a guy named Porphyry, one of his students. Plotinus hated the editing process, so he had Porphyry organize them and do some editing. So HBB wrote the scripts, but she had some people help her with the organization. But that's not really an amanuensis as we normally consider it. So, but the question of who wrote The Secret Doctrine, it's still a legitimate and valid question. And why is that? Well, she had, as we know from historical documents, she was in very close association with various of the masters, and the evidence suggests that they assisted her in the writing of The Secret Doctrine. So now we go to the next slide, which is an actual quote. This is from the preface, and I put the page number. This is the right in the beginning. I want you to look at this closely. The author, and then you have an M dash separating this. M dashes are not hyphens, they're longer dashes which are used to separate abrupt changes. The author, the writer rather, feels it necessary to apologize. Okay, the last three lines, we're not going to focus on that. That's not germane to my point. I want you to look at that first line. Author, first thing you notice, it's capitalized. And then, oh, writer. It's like you say something, you're talking to somebody, and then you quick change it. It sounds like, oh, I made a mistake. I meant to say this. But this is written down. If she had meant to say writer, she would have said the writer feels it necessary to apologize. So she wrote that down. She left that in there. That is what? That's a clue. That is a hint. That is a hint to us that the writer, HBD, is not the real author. And the fact that she capitalized it is a way of showing respect and reverence to those that worked with her. So we can go to the next slide. This is also from the preface. These truths, in other words, all the teachings that you're going to find in the Secret Doctrine, are not a revelation. And HBB doesn't say that I'm the one revealing this for the very first time. She's not. She's saying I'm a messenger. She's saying I'm a messenger for the custodians of this wisdom, this timeless wisdom. Let's go forward, please. This work is a partial statement. So the 1,500 pages in the Secret Doctrine, it's huge, 2 volumes. Even that, which many of us have spent years and years studying, trying to delve into it, that's just a partial statement of what Blavatsky was taught by more advanced students, and we know who those are. We know the names, I should say, of some of them. Supplemented in a few details only by the results of her own study and observation. So basically she's saying here, some of the Secret Doctrine are my own personal observations based on my life's work, my observation, but a lot of it is basically, she's a transmitter of these from other sources. Now, let's go ahead to the next slide. Some people say, I've heard this many times, I'm sure you have too. Oh yeah, was HPB a medium? Was she a channeler? Because it kind of sounds like it. When you first hear it, if you don't know anything about this, if you haven't studied the life of HB, you're unfamiliar with the history of the writing, you say, oh yeah, she was a medium. but was she? Not really. You know, you have the ARE organization based on the writings of Edgar Cayce. I read many of those books when I was much younger, but they say that Edgar Cayce would actually lie down on a bed or a couch and go into a sleep or trance-like state. But I have a quote coming up. We can go to the next slide. And this is from a very good article by L. Gordon Plummer. It was published in 1969, I believe, in the American Theosophist. And there's two, this quote goes into 2 slides, so I'll just read right through it. The case of the mediator is entirely different from that of the medium. And so this is for those of us who work with this or involved in theosophical work. When people raise that question, this would be a good thing to refer them to or bring up. A mediator versus a medium, they're not the same. And he describes it. During the time when he is working as the mouthpiece of his teacher, all of his faculties are awake and alert. That's not the case with Edgar Cayce and many other channelers. This activity is not accompanied by a trance condition. We can go ahead to the next slide. The mediator knows exactly what he is doing, he or she is doing, and gladly gives of himself. And he can transmit the message that the teacher wishes to promulgate. Thus, we see that the word mediator is synonymous with messenger. That's a fascinating article. I had scanned that article from the journal some years ago, and Suzanne has a copy of that. She will email that to you later today. It's a really good article, and I don't think it's widely distributed online. But anyway, it's well worth reading. It's several pages. We can go to the next slide. Now I'm going to bring in some testimonials from people that worked with her. Her colleague, Henry Steele Alcott. This is, you know, keep in mind that Henry Alcott was a great observer. He used to work in New York City in Manhattan as a newspaper reporter in his younger years. And as a good reporter, he was trained to observe. To see the hundreds of references to other authors, actually there's much more than hundreds of references, but to see the hundreds of references to other authors, one might naturally suppose her possessed of a very extensive library. Whereas, in point of fact, neither for Isis Unveiled nor the Secret Doctrine had she access to more than comparative handfuls. Henry was there, not for the entire time, but he was there many times watching her work. He sat across the table from her, and she did not have very many books with her. We can go to the next slide. This is from Archibald Kitely, one of her colleagues and friend, and he says, what struck me most in the part I was able to read during my short stay, I believe this was in England, or it might have been in France, was the enormous number of quotations from various authors. I knew that there was no library to consult, and I could see that HBB's own books did not amount to 30 in all, of which several were just dictionaries. We can go to the next one. And Jeffrey Barborka, great scholar, the author of The Divine Plan, which would be really good reading if you've read The Secret Doctrine and want to go into it further. I recommend that highly. That in itself is a very challenging work. That's The Divine Plan by Jeffrey Barborka. He said a lifetime of study would be required to obtain the ability to evaluate and utilize the citations that are provided in her volumes. Let me just emphasize here, just to evaluate the citations. She had so many. He said later on in an article, he said that the Secret Doctrine contains citations, that's references, to 1,147 different works. He actually counted them up. That's 1,147 different textbooks, some of them very obscure, ranging from the Bhagavad Gita to the Vedas to the Upanishads to Egyptian book. You know, it just goes on and on. 1,147, and many of those 1,147 had multiple quotes. So, what kind of a mind would you have to be able to survey well over 1,100 sources and pull quotes from books which were some were very dense, very deep, It's phenomenal when you think about it. So let's go ahead. Here's another quote by the head of the German TS at that time. I saw her write down sentences as if she were copying them from something before her, where, however, I saw nothing. The next quote actually goes into that a little bit. Now, this is a series of 3 quotes from old diary leaves. Most of you know that that is a multi-volume work written by Henry Alcott. It's a diary that was written over many years, 7 or 8 years period of time. I forget how many volumes, but this is a little excerpt where he was watching her write. To watch her at work was a rare and never to be forgotten experience. We sat at opposite sides of one big table, and I could see her every movement. Her pen would be flying over the page when she would suddenly stop. Next slide. She would suddenly stop, look out into space with the vacant eye of the clairvoyant seer, shorten her vision as though to look at something held invisibly in the air before her, and begin copying what she saw on her paper. Next slide. The quotation finished, her eyes would resume their natural expression, and she would go on writing until again stopped by a similar interruption. She would refocus her eyes as though there was something invisible. Some people say, well, she's looking at the Akashic records or whatever. That's a whole different topic, but she did not have a zillion books. She had maybe sometimes 10, 12, 30 books at the most in her possession. And she traveled to France, England when she was writing this. Nobody ever saw her with a vast library. She was not a scholar. She was not an academic. I mean, it would be a challenge to an academic to write a book like this with 1,147 sources. And a person like that would have to spend years and years of study in libraries. She was not that kind of a person. She was a traveler. She traveled her whole life. She traveled lightly with a suitcase and a few books. So all this is evidence suggesting that she had paranormal help, let's say, extraordinary help in writing and producing this book. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Now, here's another book that I would recommend. I don't think it's in print. I think you can buy it on Amazon, but I know TPH is not publishing the book. H.P. Blavatsky, Tibet, and Tulku. If you're a member of the Theosophical Society, of course, you can borrow it from the Alcott Memorial Library, but it's a fascinating book. It's not an easy read, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but he talks about 7 different kinds of occult processes used in the writing of the Secret Doctrine. And the next slide shows you what those 7. I'm not going to explain these, partly I don't have time, but mostly because I have to freely admit that my understanding of some of these categories is very shaky, but I'm just putting them out there. These are some of the categories that were used, according to Barborka, from his research in the producing of Secret Doctrine, and perhaps the precipitation, number 6, I think that might refer to the Mahatma letters, perhaps. But notice number 7, it introduces a strange word, writing by a process analogous to Tulku. And there's a little footnote there. You see, well, maybe you can't see that, but there's a footnote. We'll go to the next screen. And what is Tulku? It's a Tibetan word. It describes one of the cities. You know, in the Voice of the Silence, they mentioned the cities. These are the paranormal powers, but not the garden variety type. These are the higher powers. And according to Barborka, the use of this city, Tulku, was a closely guarded secret. And this ties in very closely with her training. And if you read the Mahatma letters, there's a part, some letters talk about HPB had to leave behind something of herself in Tibet to safeguard the secrets that they divulged to her. And this affected her psychologically, and Sinnott, in one of the letters, AP Sinnott tried to find out what exactly that was. We don't know, but this is something that you could perhaps, if you want to get that book, H.P. Blavatsky, Tibet and Tulku, you can either purchase it online or borrow it from the library. It's a whole different area of investigation. So, okay, so we're winding it up here. We're getting to the end of the presentation. We'll go to the next slide. What is the importance of the secret doctrine? So I want to go back to that quote by John Locke about new opinions always being suspected and opposed. This is in the 17th century. Let's go to the next slide. We have a philosopher by the name of Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer. He says, all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. People make fun of it. Second, it is opposed, sometimes violently, vehemently. And third, people come around to, okay, yeah, I can see that. That makes sense. And this might happen over a long period of time. So I think the secret doctrine, we can say that that has also passed through these stages of time. It was ridiculed, it was opposed, but these three steps can even recur today when a person who was brought up with, let's say, rather traditional Orthodox beliefs is exposed to something like the secret doctrine. They might go through all these three stages, or they might just go through the first stage and just reject it. They may never get to the third stage, but that's a process. Now, the perspective of time, this is what happens with perspective of time. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how the true value of a work, whether it's writing or music, is often not appreciated right at the beginning. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, Copernicus, Giordano Bruno, and Galileo at the time, their writings were vehemently opposed by the church and others, but over time, history proved them to be right. Move to the 19th century, the New England transcendentalist philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. You've heard his book, Walden Pond, and other writings. He wasn't persecuted or anything. He was just kind of ignored. People thought, this guy's kind of weird. You know, they thought he's somewhat of an eccentric. He lived in Walden Pond all by himself. And so he didn't gain much readership, let's say, when his books came out. But over time, in the next century, people said, you know, there's something to this. This is really deep. This is really worthwhile pondering. And now I'll switch from literature to music. Those of you that are familiar with classical music, you know the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. One of his great works is called The Rite of Spring. It's for full orchestra. The debut of Rite of Spring was in 1913. It's a very rhythmic, very colorful piece of music, unlike anything that came before. And in fact, the critics hated it. The critics panned it, and there was almost a riot in the concert hall at the time. It was so different. People couldn't handle it. But guess what? After 5-10 years, after it had a few plays, people said, yeah, this is cool. This is really good stuff. So, you know, they go through that, these new things that come along. I think Schopenhauer's right. People go through that process. So today, it's 130 years following the publication of the Secret Doctrine, and we find that for many people, the Secret Doctrine falls into that third category. Next slide, please. So let's get down to the real purpose. Why go through all this effort? Why did the masters expend all this time and energy with HPB? Why go through, what was the reason for this? You know, you have to ask that. Well, she tells you. Let's go to the next slide. And here's a series of quotes. This is from, let me see here. This is from the preface. Okay, this is from the preface. There's 5 reasons, and these are the first 3. Number 1, to show that nature is not a fortuitous concurrence of atoms. Remember, there was a materialistic view in the scientific world then. Everything was random chance. And she's saying in the Secret Doctrine, no, there's an order, there's an intelligence behind the universe. Number 2, to assign humanity its rightful place in the scheme of the universe. And number 3, to rescue from degradation the timeless truths, which are the basis of all religions. At that time, and for the several hundred years earlier, under British and European colonialism, many native religions or original religions like Hinduism, Buddhism were suppressed and ridiculed by the Christian missionaries who went to India, Ceylon, and other places, Africa. And this was one very, very valuable service that Alcott and Blavatsky did. Alcott, especially in Sri Lanka today, they have statues dedicated to him for restoring respect to Buddhist teachings, which at that time, the people who lived there were actually ashamed of it because they had been brainwashed by the Christian missionaries. And so the Theosophical Society, and still does play a role in that to some extent. Number 4, to uncover the fundamental unity from which all those truths spring. And finally, to demonstrate that the occult side of nature has never been approached by the science of modern civilization. Keep in mind, this was written 130 years ago. Today, science is much different. We have quantum physics and many other things. But somewhere else in the introduction of the preface, Blavatsky takes these 5 points and really condenses it and says, 2 reasons why I wrote this, or why it was written, is to fight scientific materialism, and number 2, religious bigotry. We still have religious bigotry, and we may not have scientific materialism as much, but we definitely have something called junk science today, where very often a big corporation wants to achieve a certain result, and they throw a lot of money at a bunch of researchers, and they say, we want you to do some research, but here's the end result. That's called junk science. It's not true science. It's not honest science. There's a predetermined outcome, and it's all money. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So summarizing all this, I think it's fair to say, and I think you'd agree with me, that after 130 years, the Secret Doctrine has withstood the test of time. It's still being read, it's still being studied, even scholars are looking into it, it's still being published. We can say that this was, in looking at the evidence and the history, and I encourage you to do this too on your own, if you're interested in that kind of a thing. This was a collaborative work. But even though it was a collaborative work with many of the adepts, HPB gets the credit. Her name is on the book as the author, and she deserves that because she went through hell to get this through. She was in poor health, she suffered, and because of her courage, her perseverance, and her incredible loyalty to the work and to the masters, we have that. She could have given up many times. She was asked, do you want to give it up? She says, nope, I got to keep plowing ahead. I got to complete it. And she suffered greatly physically, but she did it. So we can all be, we should be grateful. Actually, we should be grateful to any great writer who has left a legacy for humanity, for the world, whether it's John Milton, Blavatsky, any of the great works of art, Dante, all these authors, even if they're anonymous, like in The Cloud of Unknowing, we should always find room in our heart to have a moment of gratitude, because without these great people, our lives would be less enriched than they already are. And I think I'll close. Looks like we're doing pretty good, Suzanne, on time here. The next slide has a quote by Perucker, one of my favorite authors, Gottfried D. Perucker, and he says, I forget what book this is from, but he's a great author, great scholar. H.P. Blavatsky, breaker of the molds of mind, mover of the hearts and souls of men, producer of a new system of world thought. And I mean, that pretty much says it all. I don't think any of us could say it better than Perucker did right there. So thank you. That's my short presentation. I hope that for some of you, this may cause you to look at the Secret Doctrine with new respect, with new different sense of insight, maybe a new sense of appreciation, and maybe spur you on to do some research of your own in books like the old diary leaves, or many of the quotes that I gave you were from a book by the Countess Wachtmeister called Reminiscence of H.P. Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, and other books that were written during that period of time. We have a rich source of literature in the Alcott Library. And for those of you that like to dig into that kind of stuff, I would highly encourage you to do it, because it just makes you appreciate what we have, this great, great gift. So Suzanne, that's pretty much all I had to say.
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. And I'm so glad you mentioned at the end Constanze Wachtmeister. I just wanted to say that in chapter 4 of her book, she really describes very well a typical day of HPB, and also how she wrote the Secret Doctrine. And I think that Old Diary Leaves, there are 6 volumes, if I remember correctly. I'm opening it up for questions now, so please go ahead. I have the participants list up, most of you, so go ahead and unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask any question that you would like. And Sue Prescott, I see you are the first one, so why don't you just go ahead and do that?
So David, this was excellent. Thank you so much for this. And I want to encourage, if it's possible, to get this on the web page. It was really good. And if you need to do it in some other format, it would be fabulous for this to be available for others. So thank you so much. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, Jeff is next, and then we have Veronica. And I'm going to put this on YouTube, and when I have the link, I'm going to send this together with the handout that David had prepared for everybody.
Well, greetings from Tallahassee, Florida. Nice to see you, David. Enjoyed the presentation immensely.
Hi, Jeff.
And learned quite a lot. I've got a question. Now, I have not read, I've tried to read Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, and it's tough reading for me, and so I've read about them, but I haven't read them. But I was wondering if the same things that you have said about the Secret Doctrine could generally also be applied to Isis Unveiled.
Good question, Jeff. Yeah, in a short answer, I think yes, but since you have looked at Isis, and I assume you've looked at the Secret Doctrine, you'll recognize that the style is somewhat different. The way the Isis is written, it's sort of a sprawling, it just goes all over the place. It's but the Secret Doctrine has got, they're just different. But she did have help, and I say that from recalling some of the things that Henry Alcott wrote in Old Diary Leaves while he was observing her write Isis Unveiled. So yeah, she had help. She was, she was fully conscious at the time. She didn't go into a trance. She was sitting up at a table, but she was either looking at things in the astral light, or that's not my forte. I'd have to really prepare to talk about that. But I've read many, many fascinating things about that. Good question.
Okay, Veronica, you want to go ahead? And I also wanted to mention one thing. Ed, during your presentation, said Paris is known as the city of light because the Enlightenment started there. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, Veronica.
Hi, I want to say thank you first. And I really appreciated at the end of your presentation the mention about science. It's always been my feeling that the Secret Doctrine, particularly Secret Doctrine, had an influence on science, at least in the 20th century. You know, Einstein had a copy of the Secret Doctrine on his night table, it is said. So quite a few scientists and also psychologists, psychoanalysts, even though they are not saying that they are reading theosophy materials. But it is a fact that things are changing, in my opinion, in the realm of science. And we don't realize that maybe, other writings as well, but it starts with the Secret Doctrine. So thank you for mentioning that. You're
welcome. I think, Veronica, you brought up a really good point, is that there's a lot of professional people, even high-profile people, who have read theosophical literature, but due to their career, it's probably wise that they don't mention that, because their colleagues are not open to that kind of a viewpoint. So you have people, you have people all around, whether in psychology, scientists, academia, they may have very well read, but we'll never know.
Yeah, it's easier for artists. It's easier
Artists,
for artists to be
people yeah,
direct.
absolutely. But if you're working in academia, for example,
I know.
that could kill your career.
Yes, I taught, and I mentioned the Secret Doctrine. I never got into trouble.
By the way, if I could just show you, I mentioned I have the 1979 edition of the Secret Doctrine published by Adyar, TPH. It's a 3-volume edition. You have cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis. Pagination is the same as the original, but the 3rd volume is this index. Look at that. It's how many? You've got over 500 pages of the index for all the citations, and that was put together by Dezerkov, Boris Dezerkov, who was HPB's grandnephew. And if you don't have that 3-volume edition and you're a person who likes to look things up, you might want to purchase that just to get that index.
Okay.
The recommendation. I actually have the 6-volume set, and
That's
what
that's
what
the
I
Adyar.
like about it is that the actual volumes are smaller. I can carry them around and read them more easily, because all the words are the same.
Right. Good point. Yeah, it is lighter. The 2-volume or the 3-volume is it's a little bit heavier.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to carry around maybe in your backpack or your purse. A little heavy.
Okay. I want to read one more chat entry from Gwen. And she says, I think the other thing that is likely is that people have been influenced by things that were influenced by the Secret Doctrine and don't realize the root source. Okay, I think that's a good point.
Susanna, can I give you a real quick example of that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you've got Rudolf Steiner was influenced by the Secret Doctrine. Rudolf Steiner influenced Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield is the main influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, and J.R.R. Tolkien has influenced a ton of people. But you wouldn't, unless you actually know the lineage of some of that influence. And of course, it's colored by every single piece along the way. But I actually think that's a lot of ways in which it's influenced not just the arts, but also the sciences. I think we probably have similar kinds of influence that's not as easily traceable.
That's another excellent point. And I can draw an analogy to music. I've always been a great lover of jazz music. And I'll just mention 2 names that are quite prominent. Miles Davis, trumpet player, John Coltrane, tenor sax. They each had very distinctive styles. And lots of jazz musicians copied them. They tried to copy their styles. But then the later generation of younger musicians may not have heard the originals, but they're copying the guys that copied the original. So that's in the same sense that people may not have read the Secret Doctrine, but they're responding to ideas from people who have. So the ideas, it's kind of goes down 2nd, 3rd generation, but they're out there. The ideas continue.
Okay, is there anybody else? I unmuted Bill and John from the telephone because just let me know. Bill, did you have a question?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, well, John?
No, I'm with Bill.
Okay, good. And then Desiree, I just saw that you opened your mic. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Desiree?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes.
I can hear you better with the earphones, but you can't hear me when I have them on.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed that. That was interesting. I look forward to checking out some of the books you've mentioned, as I can't help buying books, but and maybe I'll even read them. But I wanted to mention, I was just Googling on here, that you can get the, along with the Secret Doctrine, if you go to the Theosociety.org, that you can get the index PDF. And so you know, if you don't want to buy the book or have another book like I keep buying, you can find that index there. So that's helpful that you brought that up.
That's good. You can also go to Theosophical University Press online, and they have a lot of these digitized online if you don't want to spend the 40, 50 bucks. I do that quite often when I'm doing research from home because my books might be at work in the office.
Okay, is there anybody else who has any questions?
Yes, Susanna, it's Gwendolyn again. Sorry.
Okay, sure, that's fine. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, part of what I was really interested about, so first of all, I should say thank you very much. It was a very interesting, very, very interesting presentation. The part I'm interested about personally has to do with this distinction between the medium and the mediator. What I'm trying to figure out a little bit, because I also do a fair amount of study of other traditions, and including there's an entire group of traditions, some of the African diaspora traditions, some of the pagan traditions and so forth that talk about a continuum of possessory work, from the way that the metaphor that they use for this is riding in a car. So that if you are in the front, if you're in the driver's seat, then that is essentially, I think, what we're talking about with like the mediator. Where it's like the person who is receiving the information from the other source is in total control, has total consciousness, and is basically like hearing or seeing and writing them down. Then there's being moved over into the passenger seat, in which you are allowing another being to mostly take control of your vehicle in order to speak, but you can take it back very easily. And then there's in the back seat, in which you're completely aware and conscious, but you have given over control. And then there's in the trunk, which is what you were talking about with Edgar Cayce, where the medium at that point has no knowledge, no anything. So I guess what I'm kind of interested about is like when you say that it doesn't involve trance, in those different traditions, they would say all of those, including the first one, which would be the mediator, is a form of trance, in that it is a different type of consciousness than normal waking consciousness. It requires an openness. And so I'm just kind of wondering, what is your definition of trance when you're talking about that?
Well, Barca would not agree with that. But trance, this is just off the top of my head without having really thought carefully about a definition of trance, but basically it's a passive state. One is in a passive state. Your normal state of consciousness has gone, like when you fall asleep. But the mediator, that's the term that L. Gordon Plummer used. One is fully conscious. And I don't know a lot about the native traditions where you have the medicine man and so forth. So I can't really speak to that, but I think there are probably a lot of nuances. Those two terms that Gordon Plummer used is just kind of, you might look at it as a broad category, broad division, which can be broken down into smaller subcategories.
Okay, so it's
That's
probably
how I would
they're
look.
using the, thank you very much, that's really helpful. So they're just using the language in different ways. So in this case, the difference is between passive and active versus normal normal waking consciousness versus a different form of consciousness. That's really helpful. Thank you. And
Okay.
I'll take a look at Plummer's book.
I might just give one example. This might be helpful, maybe not, but if you look at when somebody's speaking at the United Nations, you have people from all over the world who speak different languages, and they may not know the language that is being spoken at the time. Maybe it's Spanish, maybe it's Russian, but they have all headphones on, and translators are doing that. So the translator serves the function of a mediator, taking what is being said and conveying it to the listener or the recipient.
Yeah. Got it.
Can I suggest
Thank
maybe
you.
an easier term would be altered state?
Oh, they're all altered states for sure. Yeah.
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 So
Oh,
rather
that
than
absolutely.
sleep or awake, it's an altered state. So you can be open, but things are channeling differently in your awake state. So I just thought I'd throw that as a easier translation.
In a lot of the literature and the study I've done, that's more how they use trance as any form of altered state. So that was why I was trying to get the distinction between the two. So thank you. Thank you both.
Okay. So the next one who would like to ask a question is Barbara, but I just want to read one more chat entrance by Ria. And she says, Tulku are finders of hidden texts, right? Also, thanks for a great presentation. And on another note, I wondered if the experiments on psychic research would exist at the current level, but for ISIS unveiled. Okay, do you want to comment on that, David, before I move on to Barbara?
No, I think that's a fair observation. I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, very good. Okay, Barbara, go ahead.
I was just going to add that the different altered states of consciousness, I think, are ways that these people that came in at this time, whether it be Edgar Cayce or Blavatsky, they were able to tap in to the area of all knowledge. Now, Cayce didn't know he knew this stuff and that's why he went to sleep, and when he woke up, they wrote down what he said. Blavatsky, the way you described her in this talk, where she would look out and you'd see her eyes change, was almost like a channeling. To me, that's channeling. So I think, to me, Blavatsky sounds like she had the ability to do so many different ways. The fact that she had so few books and that she was taught by these Tibetan secret teachers, the Tulkus, she had this ability to hear this knowledge and be able to tap into it later, where most of us would need massive, massive notes.
Yeah, well, you remember one of the quotes I had, the early slides, was from Mahatma letter 22. And KH said they've been looking for somebody like her for a long time.
Right.
You know, she had talent, that capabilities that the average person did not have.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's why they let her come into. They said they didn't let other people into that Tibetan library. That she was one of the few Europeans that they let have this teaching. So, and I do think there was a reason. I mean, she was more Eastern. I think ARE, he was more Western. And if you look at the timing of all this, I think it was, the purpose was to, it was the beginning of the Aquarian Age, to introduce consciousness back to us that have been asleep, or introduce a new consciousness into our fifth root race.
Yeah, you know, the Theosophical Society was formed in 1875, and in the next 35 years, there were a lot of new thought movements that came about. The early 1900s, the 1890s. You look back, there's a lot of things that came forth. And I think that the TS served as kind of a catalyst for a lot of these movements. In fact, a lot of these movements were led by people who first joined the TS and then broke away and did their own thing, so to speak.
Okay, I have two more entries from the chat, and then I think we will wrap it up. From Gwen, my study of various oracular and African diaspora traditions would fall into mediator then for the most part, but there are some who go in the trunk. Most, though, do not leave their bodies. And Sue said a medium allows his consciousness to leave his body, and his body or mind can be used by a disembodied entity. A mediator retains full consciousness. That's what you said. And then Ria said, was Madame Blavatsky a Tulku, or was she communicating with Tulku? I just want to, before you answer that, David, I want to say something about what Barbara said. The way I understand it, when you read Constanze Wachtmeister's pages about how Blavatsky worked, she would stare because she would see the pages, and then she would have to, they were precipitated, and then she would have to read them. And so sometimes, because it's all reversed, she would be concerned about the pages and the page numbers, and so that they had to be verified. So I am not sure if, in my opinion, that I would call that channeling, but that she describes it, in my opinion, very well. Anyhow.
I avoid the term channeling because it really connotates a whole different category.
Yeah. Okay. And then Ria's question was about, was Madame Blavatsky a Tulku, or was she communicating with Tulku?
Well, I cannot say about that because that gets into a really obscure area. It's a good question, of course, natural question. I would just refer her and others to that book I mentioned, H.P. Blavatsky, Tibet and Tulku. She obviously had many what we would call paranormal powers. She was able to do a lot of things, entertain people in various ways. Those of you who have read the literature, the historical literature, know that. But Tulku seems to be something shrouded in secrecy. You know, knowledge can be dangerous. Knowledge gives power, and power can be used for good or ill. And it's like nuclear energy. You can use it to heat cities or to create weapons. So there are some kinds of knowledge that are best left unknown for now, left in secrecy.
Okay, I think that is it. So again, thank you so much, David, for taking the time and giving this presentation today. And I will stop the recording, and then just in case there are any other questions, let me know. I won't end the meeting right away. So
before you do that, Suzanne, let me thank you for making this possible, and also the DC Lodge. I've had a lot of fun doing this. I enjoyed putting this together and hearing your comments. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, let me stop.